Do you want my advice?
Yes, please.
You're not gonna like it.
That's okay.
You got married too fast.
That's not advice.
I told you.
Welcome back to Thinking Critical. This is Wes. We've got a special It's Complicated here today. Normally it's Gevian and myself having interesting conversations, but today we're going to do a little bit of comic book history. We brought in Ken Quattro. Thank you very much to Gevian Dargan for reaching out to him and bringing him to this guest. This is the man. If you remember, Gevian and myself and Jason Medley, a few months back, we did like the history of Black comics. They were basically talking about their time at Milestone. And I talked about a book called The Invisible Men, the Trailblazing Black Artists of Comic Books. And I said this was the only or the best resource that I could find to have like the early history of Black comic book artists. And Ken Quattro obviously is the writer of that. Thank you very much for joining us, Ken. How are you doing?
I'm doing good, Wes. Glad to be here.
I've been super excited about this. Obviously, Gevian, the man behind Animated Concepts, former assistant editor at Milestone Comics, obviously was with us as well. How you doing, Gevian?
I confess, I'm a little worried about keeping my black card after this conversation between Joe and Ken. I might be done.
And also, just mentioned here, we do have Joe Corallo, award-winning comic book editor, writer. Also, the man we like to bring onto the channel, and we're going to talk a little bit of history. He knows more than he should for his age. How you doing, Joe?
I'm all right. It's Sunday. Can't complain.
Yeah, this is going to be a great conversation. Now, Ken, this must have been a huge undertaking. A lot of these comic creators that you're talking about essentially are uncredited. So how do you go about there and research this? How long would it take you to put this book together?
Okay, well, I've been researching comic book history and stuff like that for about 50 years. I started back in the early 70s. And about 20 years back, I wanted to do a real history on Matt Baker, who was one of my favorite artists. Okay. Well, at the time, 20 years ago, there wasn't much known about Matt Baker, other than the fact that a lot of people knew he was a black artist and that he had died young, which doesn't tell you a whole lot about him. There was conflicting stories about him and stuff like that, but no real information. So I started doing inquiries like I always do. First of all, I started contacting other historians and professionals and old-time artists. I was fortunate enough to know a lot of Golden Age artists and stuff like that, and nobody really knew anything about him. Long story short, I eventually ended up getting the address of a retired black cartoonist named Samuel Joyner, who was in Philadelphia. And I wrote to Mr. Joyner, and this is back in the days before, using email all the time, especially since he was an older man. He was already in his 80s, so he didn't have a computer. So I wrote to Mr. Joyner, asking if he knew Matt Baker and if he had any information about him. Well, most of the time, when you do these cold inquiries like this, you get nothing back. And I've done it many times with a lot of different people. Well, Mr. Joyner not only responded, he wrote me a 4-page detailed letter about meeting Matt Baker, and he mentioned some other black artists he knew, and he sent me newspaper clippings. He sent me photographs of photocopies and stuff like that, and I was stunned. Because here's this big packet of stuff when I expected nothing. Well, starting with that, and me and him communicated a little bit back and forth, and I started with that. I said, wow, I'm going to see what I can find about these artists that he mentioned using my usual resources, which was most of the time was newspaper archives. Well, there was nothing in the newspaper archives about any of these men. And I go, that's really weird. Because almost every artist of any standing, in comic books, you can find newspaper articles or something, related to their lives or whatever. Because many times, especially somebody who is a good artist when they're younger, they would be, they'd show up in newspapers and stuff. Well, there was nothing about any of these black artists. And I said, that's really weird. So I had to totally change my thought process, and I said, well, what about if I start using black media, black newspapers? And that was a challenge in itself because, like I discussed with Gevian before, there was no archive of black newspapers. most libraries in the United States will carry, runs of newspapers, a lot of times the New York Times or Chicago Tribune or whatever, and at least they'll have it on microfilm. That didn't exist for black newspapers. So what I had to do was basically build like my own database of black newspapers. And I started contacting everybody I could think of that may have anything to do with black newspapers. I started contacting, libraries, schools, just anybody who might have black newspapers, if I could find something on eBay. And a lot of times I would just find like a couple issues or a short run of a couple months. Again, this took me years to put this all together. And at the end of the day, it took me about 15 years to accumulate all this information on these men. Because I would start with a crumb of information, and I would build from there. That's why I call myself a comics detective instead of a comics historian. Because what I do, I think of myself as more of a detective. The sort of work that I do. And I'm obsessive compulsive about doing this stuff the way I do it. I wouldn't recommend it to anybody because believe me, you go nuts trying to figure all this stuff out. But I use that, and I started doing genealogical research on every single one of these men. And if you read the book, you'll notice that I go back generations, sometimes 100 years or more, for some of these men, because I want people to understand that there's more to these men than the work they did in comic books. And one of the problems I've always had with comic book history, and this is a debate I've had over the years with a lot of historians, is we're very myopic about the way we look at comics history, because we tend to look at the comic book, the comic books right in front of us and very little outside of it. And we think of the people, the creators themselves, as being limited to what they did in comics. And the truth is that for many comic book artists, white and black or Asian or anything else, comic books may have only been a part of their lives, a part of their careers, especially in the past. Back in the 1940s, comic books were held in very low esteem. These guys were getting paid a couple dollars a page to do work. So for a lot of these guys, it was just something to put food on the table. And it was a transitory job that they would have, hopefully, on the way to something else like commercial art or advertising or whatever, fine art. Some guys became teachers and whatever. Well, that was especially true for these black artists, because almost every single one of these black artists that I found, they were classically trained. They'd been to art school. Some of them had studied in Europe. They studied under famous artists, and they were established artists well before they did anything in comic books. And their comic book careers really was fairly limited in comparison to what the rest they did with the rest of their lives. And that's what I try to do in the book, was show there's so much more to these men, and in their stories especially, because of the obstacles that they had to put up with, being black in the United States in the Jim Crow era and trying to make a living, and this is what they were relegated to. These guys were like Elmer Snoder is a classic example. This man was a fine artist who came out of the Harlem Renaissance in the 1920s. I mean, he worked in commercial art. He studied in Paris. He was a well-established fine artist. But by the 1940s, or the 1930s, really, it was during the Depression. He couldn't find a job and stuff like that. So, like a lot of other artists, the only job they could find was comic books. And anyways, I know it's a long answer to your question, but I just trying to give a little background here.
As an intelligence analyst myself, which I did that for about 16 years in the United States military, I applaud you. That's a lot of research to do to find an answer, because you really do have to dig all these things. And I was reading up, on some of these people, and Elmer Snoder was really interesting. He was an artist on Blue Beetle, right?
Yes, he was. He was actually probably the classic Blue Beetle artist of the 1940s, because he really did it for about 3 or 4 years, and which he's never been credited for. If you go look at like in Overstreet, or if you go look on the Grand Comic Book Database, you don't see Elmer Snoder credited, but he not only drew them, he wrote all the Blue Beetle stories and everything for years. For years, he drew every single cover for every single Fox comic book from 1944 to 1946. Every single Fox comic book.
So the one with him punching Nazis is him as well, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's crazy.
And see, that's what when I kept coming across these men, I would go like, how could they've not been known? And that's basically where the title Invisible Men comes from, because of the circumstance. There's all different circumstances that came into play here, but there were societal reasons why they weren't seen, because just like Ralph Ellison talks about in his book Invisible Man, where I basically got my idea from for the title. He talks about not being seen by white people. Like I said, me and Gevian talked about this before. It's, blacks lived a dual life. They call it a dual identity in the sense of like, they would live amongst, their family and their friends and everything in the black community, but often they had to work in the white world. And it was two different identities that they had. And in the white world, they're often totally ignored by the white people around them. And so many of the white Golden Age artists I talked to, they were emphatic about the fact they never knew any black artist. They never personally knew any of them, maybe Matt Baker and Alvin Hollingsworth, the only two that ever came up in conversation. And I spoke to a lot of them about it. And there was a reason for that, because these black artists work through comic shops. And see, comic shops, even though we're not aware of that in most conversations about old comics, but comic shops produced probably 90% of the comics that came out in the 1940s. It wasn't like it is now, where you have an artist who's hired by a company and he's well known and he gets to do what he wants and bounces around. At that time, comics were just being churned out as quick as they could, as cheaply as they could. And there was, to do it, these guys like Jerry Iger, Will Eisner, and Harry Chesler, and people like that, they created comic studios which would produce comic books on basically like an assembly line basis, where one guy would do the penciling, they would hand it over to another guy who would do the inking, somebody else would do the writing, and they try to get out as fast as possible. And so what a lot of these every single one of these black artists worked through comic shops. And the advantage for them is that they didn't have to interact with white publishers and editors. Comic shops weren't picky about who they hired, okay? So a black artist could go into a comic studio, say like for Jerry Iger. He could get an assignment from Jerry Iger to draw something, take it home, do it in his own studio, bring it back in, and never have to interact with even the other artists in the studio, because they would never even see him. And that's, again, these guys didn't even know who they were working with. Well, one more story. I know I'm rambling on here.
No. Love it. Okay. Keep it coming.
But one more story is, there's a well-known Golden Age artist named Maurice Whitman. He did a lot of stuff for Fiction House and stuff like that. Well, early in Maurice Whitman's career, he was paired up with a black artist named Ezra Jackson. Okay? He was white. He would do most of the penciling, and Ezra Jackson did most of the inking. They worked together for over 2 years. And yet, I spoke to Maurice Whitman's son, and he never mentioned ever working with a black artist. He never knew he worked with a black artist, because chances are he would do the penciling. It would be handed off to Ezra Jackson, who'd probably take it home and ink it himself, and then he'd bring it back. So you were collaborating with somebody who you never even knew. And so these guys were totally unknown, even with their peers.
That's pretty
very, very strange situation.
Joey, we've talked about this a little bit when we were kind of talking about some of the history of women in comics, and a lot of them are uncredited as well.
Yeah.
Like, you have to really go in there and actually, like, almost get the verbal history of comic books to find out who some of the earliest female writers and artists in here. And it sounds like in Ken's case that you almost have to do it that way. I mean, how much of it is like the oral history of comic books that you ended up having to do while you were sleuthing this?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, you had a lot of pen names and stuff like that with women who were involved in comics. And, just to kind of follow up on what you were talking about, Ken, I'm going to butcher this name, so please correct me. But was it Adolphus? How do you say it? About?
Well, just Adolphe Barreau was what he changed his name.
Barreau. Yeah, Barreau. Yeah. So with someone like Barreau and reading through that and his history of deciding to
pass as white.
Yeah, pass as white and just stick to it. Do you feel, based on your extensive research over the years, that there are possibly countless other artists who may have done something similar and we'll just never know how many? Or was this a very... Do you feel this was a very specific case?
Okay, I can see Gevian wanting to say something over there, but do you want to jump on this?
I'm just going to piggyback on one thing before you answer Joe's question, because what you got me with, I believe it was in the intro, was I'm a huge fan of Crazy Cat. Huge fan of Crazy Cat. I got introduced to that strip in my first year of high school. I don't want to butcher my art teacher's name at the time, but he introduced it to me. And I had no idea that he was part black. No idea they was part black. So one of the questions I had, and it makes answer with Joe's question, is why wasn't there a profile on Harriman in the book, given the popularity of Crazy Cat and the contributions it made to the medium? Was it because of the fact that he basically, if I remember right, he typically identified as white whenever he had to write something down? But you're exactly right. How many people are out there, black artists out there?
Well, in the case of Harriman and other black cartoonists, I left them out because this was specifically about comic book artists. You know, Harriman never worked in comic books and stuff like that. And the comic book artists had a very unique, it's a very unique group, and it's a history unto itself, even separate from other black cartoonists. Yeah. So that's why I handled it in that way, because if there's other guys like Tim Jackson who have done like pioneering cartoonists of color and stuff like that, who have gone more into the other black cartoonists. But people like Jackie Orms and stuff like that I could have written about, but then it'd be a gigantic
omnibus.
Exactly. Well, I'll tell you right now, I mean, this is only part of what I have. Okay, I'm already working on the sequel to this book right now, and there's much more that's going to come out, even about some of the artists I've already written about. But getting back to the passing for white thing, that was very common in the early years of the 20th century, because for many blacks, that's the only way they could succeed, was to pass as white. If your skin was light enough, a lot of blacks would take advantage of that, and it's totally makes sense. It was in reading all these black newspapers. Like, I literally read thousands of black newspapers, going from like the 1950s, going all the way back to the 1800s, and that was an ongoing controversy amongst blacks themselves, because some would say it was insulting, to do that. Others totally, subscribe to it, say that it just makes sense. If you're able to take advantage of the color of your skin, because the whole ludicrous thing about racism is that it's based upon skin color. And, as stupid as that sounds, and someday people look back and say, like, were they crazy? It's, if you could get away with it, a lot of people took advantage of it. And, Bro took advantage of it. Elmer Snoder didn't, even though he had very light skin. You can't tell too much from the photographs. But I've recently been in contact with somebody who grew up with Elmer Snoder. Okay, they grew up with him as they were a child and he was an older man. And he went out of his way to make sure people knew he was black, yet his sister passed as white. And they had exactly the same skin tone. So it was very much an individual choice that people made. Brown was unique, though, in that he created an entirely different identity for himself. And he went to the extreme of, he became an arch conservative. He joined the Sons of the Confederacy. He would write articles to his hometown newspaper in Charleston, South Carolina, condemning all the liberals up in New York City and how much he hated them. And he was friends with all these segregationists like Strom Thurmond and stuff like that. And his son, who's alive today, who I didn't mention in the book because I didn't want any legal difficulties, is a big wig in the Republican Party today. Okay, again, I didn't want to. He worked for Richard Nixon, as a matter of fact. Okay, so it was a choice that people made. It was something, again, it was taking advantage where you could, because what other option they have? I mean, as a black person in those days, there was very few options open to them. In 1940, okay, just to give you an idea, in 1940, the largest employer of blacks in the United States was porters on trains. Okay, that's ridiculous. I mean, when you think about it, that was the highest aspiration that a black person, an average black person had, was to be a porter on a train, which is basically just putting bags on and collecting tickets and stuff like that. So if they could get a foot up some other way, they would.
Yeah.
So Gervais, that's a pretty crazy story. I mean, what are your thoughts when you get in this book and you finally start learning some of this history? It's kind of mind blowing that it was essentially going to be lost to the ether, right? No one was ever going to know about it if somebody like Ken didn't go in there and spend 15 years kind of compiling it all together.
No, it's like, like you had mentioned earlier in the show when we were talking, the three of us along with Jason were talking about it, and you had mentioned Ken's book, Invisible Men. And I admit, it was like I kind of heard it, and it was like, it's like went over my head. But then I'm in the comic shop during Free Comic Book Day doing my rounds, and then I saw the book displayed, and it had Blue Beetle and Phantom Lady in the cover, and I'm very familiar with those characters, if not the creators behind them. So that's what drew my eye. And when I read the Trailblazing Black Artists and Comic Books, I was like, oh no, you're not going to tell me that they were black artists behind Blue Beetle and Phantom Lady. So that's why I plunked down to $35 to pick it up. And as I started going through it, and much like what Ken is alluding to, you realize the parallel with the war effort going on, and how it opened up, much like it opened up for women, this opportunity to become more of the workspace, and then the same thing with the black artists. I was, as I said to Ken, I told him, I said, thank you for this book. Thank you for, it's kind of like there was this book that came out called Hidden Figures, which talked about the involvement of black women and basically pretty much the space race. And I'm a huge, if not history buff, documentary buff. And I would tell people, I've watched tons of stuff about the space race on the History Channel, tons of stuff on National Geographic or whatever it is. Never heard of these three women. Never. This is literally, if you're an X-Files fan, when you talk about Operation Paperclip, they brought over all of these German scientists and engineers to come over and do the thing that nobody could be done. And this was homegrown talent, which is basically running circles around these guys. And it's the same thing here. Like when I'm looking at Matt Baker's work, and I don't know how much of an influence Eisner was on him. It seems like from the profile that Ken wrote, they kind of missed each other a little bit by a few years. But it's like the stuff is just gorgeous. I mean, it is just absolutely gorgeous. When you talk about in terms of draftsmanship, it's like it's clear he was at the top of his game. Not only then, but you could even put him up against some of the people today. And what I really found interesting, not just the profiles in the book, but both Dr. Carpenter's introduction and Ken's pretty much forward and afterward, because what I found interesting was the Double V campaign and the series that came out, that the Challenger, and also the Youth Builders effort that I would like Ken to talk a little bit about, because what it is that there's nothing new under the sun, So a lot of times we get on this channel into the SJW woke stuff. But here's some clear examples, especially this whole thing with the youth builders when they basically went up against false publications about the Steamboat character. I'd like Ken to elaborate on those two things, because I thought that was fascinating.
Well, the youth builders you're talking about was a group, I think it was basically in New York City in that, of young blacks who were really offended by the character Steamboat who appeared in Captain Marvel comics. And Steamboat was supposedly like a comedy relief sort of character, and but he just was typical minstrel sort of character, you know, that they used often, especially pre-World War II, because before and after World War II, the depiction of blacks did change slightly. And that's a story I'm going to get into more in my sequel and stuff. But the character Steamboat was particularly offensive, you know, if you go back and if you want to Google it and stuff like that. So they actually went to Fawcett. You know, they went to the offices of Fawcett, these young kids, and they told them this, you know, they let them know, say, look how offensive this is. You know, we're human beings. This isn't you know, we're not caricatures. You know, we're not animals. And Fawcett listened, and that was the first, you know, indication, I think, that, you know, it kind of dawned on some of these publishers, you know, what are we publishing here? You know, what are we doing here? And, you know, a lot of that goes to, I'm going to get off on the subject a little bit here, but a lot of that is attributable to World War II itself. Americans became, I don't want to say woke, but they became aware of the dangers of prejudice and everything when they saw what the Nazis did to the Jews. And for a lot of Americans, it took a while until the end of the war. They started finally seeing pictures of the concentration camps and all the stuff like that, and they saw what racism and anti-Semitism and all this hatred could do. And I think people started internalizing that, and they started, you know, doing a lot of looking at themselves. And yes, it didn't change overnight, and it's still changing. And I don't want to get into all, you know, stuff like that right now, but, you know, people started taking a look at themselves, and I think a lot of people in creative positions did too. And if you talk about comics net, to me a classic example is Will Eisner. I mean, I idolize Will Eisner, like I told you guys, you know, but I'm also very aware of the character of Ebony, and I've written about that, you know, before. And see, I have an article I've written before, it's posted somewhere online, about the problem with Ebony, you know, and Will Eisner, you know, how can you hold this man, this genius, in such high esteem, but you have this incredibly racist character that there's no excuse for. Okay, there's no excuse for. You know, you can't possibly, you know, wrap your head around it. But Eisner was aware of that. You know, especially by war's end. You know, he tried to kind of like soften the depiction of Ebony. If you see Ebony pre-war and Ebony post-war, there's a definite difference in the way he's depicted. You know, even though he's still, you know, very racist, you know, to our eyes. And he also introduced the character of who's it, Lieutenant Gray, I believe, was introduced, who was you know, like a police lieutenant, and you know, he was black and stuff like that. So he tried to backtrack, but he can't erase the image of Ebony, you know, in the creation of Ebony. If you ever look at the very first panel Ebony appears in, it's one of the most racially offensive characters you can possibly imagine. You know, I have the first, you know, Spirit section. And when you look at that, and you go like, how could he have done that? And he was a very intelligent, very open-minded man. But it was just integrated in American society. And you see it throughout, you know, the comics of that time. And every single, you know, even though comic book history doesn't want to look at that, I'm going to force them to look at that in the sequel of my book, because you're going to see some of the images. I'm going to show that every single comic book artist that we idolize from that time period did the same thing. And, they all, have their depictions, these racist depictions, stuff like that. And it's something that, it's a part of comics history, it's part of American history, that you can't look away from things you don't like. I had this discussion some years and years ago. An older comic book historian told that to me. He says, because I often come across things that are very controversial. And you guys would have to go back and read some of the things I've written and stuff like that. And there's a lot of times I tick people off. I personally don't care, because to me the truth means more than anything else, okay? And one of the things that always bothers me is that when people try to smooth over history, or they try to just tell the parts of history they like. And this old-time comic historian told me, he goes, Ken, he says, you can't just report the history you like. He says, you have to tell the truth. And I have a journalistic background, and that strikes me right in the heart of what I believe, is that, you have to tell the truth when you're talking about history, whether you like it or not. And that's how people learn. Because if you spew crap, and people know that after a time, they know you're lying. And part of the problem we have as Americans is looking at the whole truth about our history. And that, again, it's just a long way of getting back around what I try to do with everything I write, not just this book. But that's what I hope that people get out of it.
It's crazy. Back I think there was actually an all-black comic publisher for a very short time. I think it was all Negro comic books.
Right.
And one of the reasons that didn't continue on, it wasn't because the talent was ready to move on. I think people wouldn't sell them paper, or something.
That's what the family. It was Orrin Evans. Orrin Evans was a highly respected journalist. I mean, he worked for a lot of white newspapers. He was a runner-up for one of the most prestigious awards called the Haywood Broun Award in the 1940s for his reporting and everything. And when his newspaper went under in Philadelphia, he was waiting for a white newspaper. Him and actually it was 3 other white editors from this defunct newspaper put together all Negro Comics. And his idea was to publish a comic book using black creators in a comic book just featuring black characters. The first issue, there was over 300,000 copies printed of it. And it was mostly distributed, from what I can tell, on the East Coast and in the West Indies islands. But the comic book is very rare today, so I don't know how much was actually distributed. I know that's what the print run was, but I don't know how much was distributed. Well, he went ahead, and the artwork for the second issue supposedly exists, according to the Evans family. It was totally completed and ready to go to print, but no paper dealers would sell him the paper because he was black. And it's hard to wrap your head around stuff like that. But that's within living memory. That's 1947, 1948. That's only a couple years before I was born. Yeah. And it's staggering to realize that's part of our history. And again, that's what I want people to understand. You don't have to preach. You just show people the facts and let them determine for themselves what the truth is.
Yeah, I just to put a point on what you were saying, I mean, 3 of my grandparents are still alive, and they were all born and at least kids, if not teenagers, when some of this stuff was going on. My paternal grandmother, she would have been a teenager in those years, and she's with it. We grab coffee, we talk all the time. These are people. A lot of people still around now, and this was their lives within their own memory, and they remember these things, and that's really important. And I just want to to kind of piggyback a little bit more on the Steamboat part, because DC within the last year or two solicited doing a collection of Shazam comics that would have had the Steamboat character, and they pulled it, citing that issue and the issue of the racial insensitivity. And, you know, to me, I feel that not only is that cowardly, it's part of whitewashing history.
Exactly. Thank you, Joe. And I couldn't agree with you more. I don't know how the rest of you guys feel, but see, that is exactly my stance on all this. Yeah. You can't shy away from this stuff because you don't learn anything if you do. Because to a younger person, you know, a comic book fan now, they would go like, well, what are you talking about? Everything was Superman and Batman and Wonder Woman and everything was nice and everybody was happy and stuff like that. But it wasn't, you know, and there was people being overlooked. I mean, when you think about it, you didn't see a black face in most comic books ever, unless it was in an insulting way. I mean, throughout the entire golden age, which is kind of ironic in itself, entire golden age of comics, almost every depiction of a black person is either as, you know, for humorous effect, or they were a jungle native attacking, you know, the white jungle god and the girl tied up to the post and stuff like that. Yeah. I mean, to me, one of the most ironic things is almost every single one of these black men that I wrote about, these black artists, at one time or another had to depict some of these white jungle gods. All of them. You know, I mean, Jay Jackson, you know, he did a character called Blonde Garth, who was about a white jungle god who was, you know, lording over all these black natives. Now think about that. He's a black man, and he has to depict a guy with blonde hair named Blonde Garth who's ruling over these black natives. You know what I'm saying? It's just so bizarre. You know, yet editors thought nothing about making an assignment like that. Joe, you're an editor. Could you possibly even think of doing something like that? I mean, you see what I'm saying? It's just so weird. And that's why people, you know, people have, to me, we have to know our history. You know, no matter what it is, good and bad. You can't shy away from that kind of stuff because you learn nothing.
You know, Ken, I can tell you for specific, there are conversations going around by the high-end, like, comic collectors. You know, my friend of the channel, Paley, has talked to people about this, and there is a sentiment amongst a certain part of them that they need to acquire any comic book that has a portrayal like that and destroy them.
Well, that's another big thing for me. Censorship of any kind offends me to the core. I can't tell you how much it does. I mean, like I said, whether I like it or not, you know, I have my own personal beliefs on things and that, and it doesn't matter. People have the right, you know, in this country to publish, you know, what they want, and we can't destroy it. We can't hide it away and stuff like that. People have the right to it. That's what the whole First Amendment's about and everything. And if you're going to start destroying books and stuff like that, then, you know, this is, you know, Fahrenheit 451. And
I can tell you right now, I've seen the conversations. It's a real conversation being had, and I couldn't be more against it.
Yeah. But yeah, Wes, I'm not real popular with a lot of comic book collectors for a lot of reasons. I mean, I'm a huge opponent of slabbing comics, just for the reason I can't understand taking a comic book, put it in plastic, where it's locked away forever and nobody can read it. I mean, to me, that's insane. You know, one of the things I've always done, like I said, I have a lot of rare comic books, and they're totally open and available to anybody who wants to read them. I have stuff that, well, I have one comic that there's only one copy in existence, but I have a lot of copies there's only a couple copies of. I use them all the time. You know, and I've allowed other people to use them for research and stuff like that. What you're taking is you're taking history and encapsulating it. That's like taking the Dead Sea Scrolls and putting it in the box and locking it away somewhere. I mean, what good does that do for anybody? Nobody. You don't learn from it. You know, we need more learning in the world. We need more knowledge in the world, not less. You can't hide things from people. Yeah. I'm sorry. I started getting.
No, that's okay, but yeah, I think what's interesting about it is that when you're talking about the whole Youth Builders thing and the whole thing that the Steamboat exists. If you kind of like what Joe was saying, if you have this collection, and I thought Warner Brothers or whoever it was at the time, when they started releasing some stuff, particularly the Tom and Jerry cartoons, which I'm a big fan of, and there's the whole, I believe the black woman that they have in those cartoons is called Mammy, and they had Whoopi Goldberg do an introduction to that set of cartoons that I thought was respectful of. Look, these are things that at the time, these were accepted ways to depict black people at the time, and by kind of like, as Joe put it, whitewashing it, you're not doing anybody a service by doing that. It's like, okay, this is how it's depicted at the time. In some cases, you're going to find it funny, and then maybe you have to talk about how you find those particular things funny, but to not talk about it takes away from the fact of having an opportunity to learn. And then you start to see a through line through it, because we have Karen Berger right now. I know she became the issue of the moment when she basically said comics has always been the domain of basically, I think, white straight males or whatever it is. But what I found interesting in both the Stoner profile and both the Matt Baker profile is that they're co-collaborators. I know at least for Stoner, a white woman who was his wife, and then with Matt Baker, I don't think you gave the ethnicity of her, but still a female. So even as you're talking about these black artists and how they were hidden, there's also the fact that you had a lot of these female collaborators, and in the case of Matt Baker, of course, I believe it was the editor. It's like, so Perch, who's also a friend of the channel, made a video about this when he said that basically what Karen Berger is saying is a lie. I think that's what the importance of this is that these issues are not new. It's not like when you had something like an Ebony or a Steamboat, like, well, black people are like, well, we understand what's going on. I said, no, there were people who were like, oh, wait a minute now. And not only am I personally find it offended, do you realize it's like this is becoming sort of a calling card to the world in how we're being perceived and how we're being looked at. So I like I said, I hold my powder, I keep my powder dry when it comes to the cancel culture stuff, as Wes and I have talked on many occasions before. I said, do your due diligence first, and then we'll go from there. We used to call it boycotting, but I don't know what this new thing is now. Right. But the simple fact of the matter is you don't do yourself a service by acting like something doesn't exist or didn't exist.
Exactly.
Or it still exists now.
Well, because what it does, Gervain, if you hide all this stuff away, it doesn't provide context to what came, to a lot of anger and everything that came afterwards. Because people will say, like, well, I don't get it. What are you upset about and stuff like that. And unless you could show what they were upset about. Like, I would love that like a lot of these older black newspapers could be more available to people. I recently we had the honor of speaking with the head librarian of at the Library of Congress, which was Dr. Carla Hayden. And that was one of the things I spoke to her about. I said, how come we don't have these archives of black newspapers? And she totally agreed with me. She goes, you're right. She goes, there is no like accessible thing. You have like the Schomburg collection in New York and stuff like that.
Yep. Right.
Yep. Right, but it's so sporadic. You know what I'm saying? It's not accessible to the average person. Like, I can go online today and find newspapers from some podunk town in Iowa going back 150 years. But you're not going to find that for most black newspapers. You may find, runs of the Defender or New York Amsterdam News, but there's black newspapers all over the country. And, they all carry... It's fascinating to read this because you're seeing American history through different eyes. You're not seeing it through, you're not seeing American history that I was taught back in the 1960s when I was in school, okay? You're seeing a much wider view of American history. And that's what I think, what we need, not only in this country, but in the entire world, because the more you're exposed to, the more open-minded you are and more understanding you are of other people.
Yeah, I mean, I guarantee a lot of people listening to this and a lot of other people out there haven't even put it together in their minds that there were black newspapers until a certain time. I mean, and they don't even, even celebrate local black cartoonists, and like I grew up on Long Island, and there was Broomsick Brandon Jr. did a strip in Newsday. That was the local newspaper here in 70s, I think late 60s, 70s, and forward. Mm-hmm. I had to learn about that on my own. And that wasn't something I learned in high school or college or anything. Right. I had to find that stuff on my own. And he was a local cartoonist for the local paper that I read and we had a subscription to in this house as a kid. So there really is this desperate need to teach people that just basic history on this stuff. Right,
and again, one of my big complaints about comics history in general is that it's so closed off. We're so focused upon just certain artists, certain comic books, certain genres. Like, I grew up, reading Marvel comics and DC comics and superhero. I love all that stuff. I'm not going to, I'm not going to say it. I do. I always have. But there's so much more to this medium than than Jack Kirby, okay? Mm-hmm. I mean, Jack Kirby was great. But guess what? So was Matt Baker. So was Jay Jackson. So was Elmer Snoder. You see what I'm saying? There's been thousands of artists, creators who've worked on comics, many of them incredibly talented people. But we have such a limited view of the history of this medium. I've been approached about possibly doing a book of Jay Jackson's, there's a Speed Jackson strip, and I don't want to go much, but they're talking about doing a movie about it even. This is something you guys aren't supposed to know, but newsflash, okay, you're getting it. But they talked about doing a Speed Jackson movie based upon Jay Jackson's Speed Jackson strip, which ran in the Chicago Defender. Most people never even heard of it. Okay, it was brilliant. He wrote about, I just have a little clip of it in here, but he had a 9-month sequence in 1944 of Jay Jackson, who was he was like a secret agent guy, a black secret agent working for the U.S. military. And in this one sequence, he goes to Africa to fight some Nazis who were trying to take over this little country. And what he does, he stumbles upon this hidden black nation, advanced black nation that nobody's known about ever before, and it's an advanced black. It's basically Wakanda. Okay, only this is 1944. Okay, everybody goes on and on about Jack Kirby and Stan Lee. Guess what? Jay Jackson did it in 1944. Nobody knows that. And to me, it's mind-boggling. And there's even more stuff, I could tell you guys about that. Again, I'm holding off, and it's going to be in the second book, so I don't want to spoil it all. But, that we, comics history has got to widen its view. It's got, to be taken seriously. Because it's got to get beyond the fanish origins of it, and I was one of the guys who was involved in all that back in the early 60s. I was involved. I went to some of the very first I went to the third comic book convention ever. They had them here in Detroit and stuff like that. So I was involved with all those guys in the beginning there. And we got to get beyond that, if we want to be taken seriously by the rest of history. And we are now. I mean, we are, it's to me, that's very heartening to see that, Like I said, I was invited by the Library of Congress to have this discussion with the head librarian, and she became a fan based upon my book. She saw my book, she bought it, and she invited me to have a discussion with her and Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee, whose father was Ezra Jackson. He was a comic book artist, a black comic book artist, which, she thanked me for writing about him. She goes, my father was so hurt by the comic book industry because he lost his job. What happened to all these black artists, the vast majority of them, after World War II, when the white artists came back, they were given their jobs back. And so all the black artists lost their jobs with comic books, and Ezra Jackson was one of them. He never worked in comic books again until the 1960s, when he got a job with Golden Legacy Comics, Bertram Fitzgerald's series. And then he started doing those horror comics for Migrant Fast. I don't know if you guys know those things like Shock and all those, terrible comics or in the early 70s there, but he made his way back in the comics. But it took 20-some years before he did it.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, Ken, is there anywhere that has a collection, of art from these artists? Is there any place that maybe has a partial collection, or is it just you have to put it together yourself?
In Schaumburg, they have art by some of these artists, but as far as like comic pages, it's only incidentally. Like, for instance, like I've owned Matt Baker artwork, from things that he did for the Iger shop, because he was working for the Iger shop and he was so popular. There's Alvin Hollingsworth artwork out there, but as far as like the rest of these guys, it's only incidentally if you come across it. Some of these guys, I don't think any of it exists anywhere, but because most of this artwork was thrown away, back in the day. Jerry Iger was one of the few who kept all the artwork that people produced for his shop, and he sold it all off in the 1970s. So there's a lot of it out there. You could search around on eBay or on sites like that. You can find a Matt Baker page, but you won't pay an arm and a leg for it. But
that's crazy. There's nowhere where you could go and appreciate all this history.
No, I mean,
in your book, obviously, and then in the sequel, which makes them even more important.
Well, again, it took me a long time to hunt down some of these comics too, because some of these, like the one with Vuda in it, it was Crown Comics #3. Vuda, in my opinion, should be one of the top 10 comic books of all time as far as for importance, because that was the first time a black character had his own feature, a black hero had his own feature in a mainstream white comic book. And that's 1945, 2 years before all Negro comics, and that was Matt Baker. And he
predates Lobo, who was generally considered to be the first.
Right, by 20 years. That's what I mean.
Yeah, I didn't have no idea.
I'm on several Facebook pages with black collectors and stuff like that. And when I've told them about Vuda, they're shocked. They go like, "What? What do you mean there was a black hero back in the 1940s?" But he was. He had his own feature. But what was ironic about it is, even though he had his own feature within the comic book, he was depicted as white on the cover. The cover had Vuda, but he was white. And the reason why is because they couldn't sell newspapers down south with a positive black character on the front cover.
Be offensive or banned.
Yeah, the distributors wouldn't put it on stands. I mean, again, this is within living memory. This is the late 1940s. It's hard to understand that, for people to wrap their head around that sometimes, but it's important that they know it.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So, Ken, when is the sequel? Do you have a date when you have an idea when it's going to come out?
Well, that's funny you mentioned that, because in this week I'm going to sort of like take my leave from Facebook and any other social media, because unfortunately I end up spending time on there just chatting with people and stuff like that, and this will probably be the last thing I do with any podcast and that for a while, because I got to sort of like sequester myself and really hit it hard. I have this book already promised to my publisher, and actually there's another book I'm working on at the same time for the same publisher. It's kind of related to what we were talking about today, but I don't want to tell you about that yet either until it comes out. But I'm kind of looking at it, having this done hopefully by the spring. Ever since my book won the Eisner Award, they're putting a lot of pressure on me now to get this thing out as quick as they can, because they want to kind of capitalize on that. So
it must be a huge honor with you being such a big Will Eisner fan yourself. You gotta.
I know, that's to me was the coolest part, was winning the Eisner Award. And I'm an Eisner fan. I just had the idea that they're like, wow. I still haven't got my trophy though. That's still in the mail, supposedly.
I definitely want to have you back on to talk Will Eisner up, but this has obviously been really informational. Like mine, kind of really just thinking about all the information that you're kind of giving there. And there's actually so much more. You got a sequel and another project that's associated with it. Gervain, what were your takeaways from the book? Do you have any final thoughts before we kind of wrap this up?
My takeaway from the book is that it's kind of like there's a series, and I'm going to mangle the film series name. Bear with me just 1 second, and I just want to make sure before I say it, I got the right one. because it's kind of like there's this whole Hidden Colors. It's a film series called Hidden Colors, and then it's the same takeaway I have from watching that series. I own at least the first 3. I'm saving up for the next 2 from Hidden Figures and also from Invisible Men. Is that I know for those of us in the Black community who appreciate it, and I think other people as well, is that the takeaway is that we were always there, and I think that's something that's very powerful when you come up in the age that I came up, which is the 70s and 80s. When you talk about media, with the exception of some of the stuff that Norman Lear was doing, you saw very few positive representations, much less honest representation of who you were as an ethnic group. People know I don't necessarily buy into the getting away from the race thing, but the ethnic group. But I think that to me was the big takeaway. But I think the other big takeaway for me is this, and I appreciate what Ken's saying about us having to know this stuff, is there is a feeling amongst a lot of people, especially in our American culture and society, that talking about our history, both good and bad, somehow is going to make people hate America or hate the country as a result. And I think it's the exact opposite. I think the more we look at the history and more we look at the bad stuff, we also see the invisible parts. We see the good stuff. There was a documentary called Pray the Devil Back to Hell, which talked about situations that were going on in Africa. And when they screened it to a bunch of students, basically the students were like, well, where are the good black men in this? Because you had the very over-the-top warlord figures who were, basically wrecking things all over the place. And what the filmmaker realized was that the kids did not recognize those scenes, all the men who were helping the men and the women and the children get out of the village before the warlord got there, pulling the cards, getting people to safety, things like that. And I think when we don't talk about our history, however painful it might be, however embarrassing it might be, however you go, how would people even thinking about that? We all do ourselves a disservice. I know it's painful and I know it hurts, but when you start to talk about it, you realize there's a through line. There's not just a through line of what the problem is, but there's also a through line of what the solution is. And I think that's the importance of that's, for me, those are the 2 big takeaways. And again, I want to thank Ken. I want to thank Yo Books. I want to thank IDW Publishing and everyone who contributed to this, because for me, this has been greatly enlightening. If I can drag my girls to read it and anyone else, I'm going to get it in front of them. But thank you. It's a real contribution in ways that are unimaginable.
Thank you, Gevian.
Absolutely.
So, Joe, I know you are a comic historian. You like to go back in the Wayback Machine and try to keep up on all this stuff. Now that you got into the book, we talked to Ken here. Do you have any final thoughts or questions for Ken before we wrap this up?
No, sure. It's of course an enlightening read. I think anyone who has any interest in the important thing here is if you have any interest in comics history, you can remove. This isn't just Black history. This is comics history.
It's not an amendment. It's part of the history.
It is the
can't know the history without
whole. Yeah. And to further some of Gevian's points, there is no country or group of people without sin. There's none of that in existence. We've come a long way. I think when we whitewash things, in the past, it's hard to realize how far we've come.
Right.
And so it's important to put that in perspective. We've come pretty far. We still need to do better. And the only way we're going to get there is understanding how far we've come and where we have to go, or else we're just going to keep getting lost along the way.
Right.
So, Ken, in the video description, there will be obviously a link to Amazon if you want to order it there. I'll have a general description of what's in the book. I imagine it's at comic shops. That's what Gevian says he got it at. There's no comic shops, unfortunately, in the Philippines. Is there anywhere else people can get access to this book if they're interested in reading up on all these wonderful stories?
Well, I know that you can download a Kindle version of it, which might work for some people, and especially like in your situation where you're not close by a comic shop and you don't want to pay $50 shipping.
It is $50.
Because that's where I've heard from several people, like in Australia and stuff like that, who want to get the book, but they said it costs more for shipping than the book itself costs. I've been trying to press the publisher to actually they're going to be doing a paperback version of it, because I want to make it available to more and more people. We've had a lot of interest from schools, because there's some colleges they've already they're using it in some courses and stuff like that. I want to make it as available to people as possible. I'd like to donate some copies, but that's one thing to get a publisher to do that. And, it's easy for me to say that. I don't have to do that. But, I would say trying to download the Kindle version would probably be the cheapest way for somebody to get it. And I know you can do that through Amazon and Barnes & Noble, I believe, also.
Absolutely. So it's just a fantastic conversation. Ken, I really appreciate you coming on here, sharing your story, sharing the history that having a really great conversation. Do you have any final thoughts, just kind of wrap this up, with all the investigative work that you went in there, the detective work, 15 years of your life to get these stories out there. I can't imagine how fulfilling it's been to win an Eisner Award, but really to have the textbook being used in college courses to teach history so this can't be lost again.
To me, that's the most fulfilling part of it, Wes, is that, everything I write, like I always tell people, I write basically for myself, which sounds weird, but, I write for things that, that interest me, and I want other people to share in the knowledge that I've picked up over the years. I'm not so egotistical to think that I'm such a great writer or anything like that, but I have come across a lot of interesting stuff over the years, and when I started coming across all this information about these black artists, I realized there's more to it than just comic book history, and that's why I made it, a book that sort of, crosses into, areas other than just, it would interest somebody other than comic book people. I would say almost half the people I've heard from, from emails and strangers and stuff like that have never even, or they're not comic book fans. But there was a lot of people in the black community who've never read a comic book, or at least not big comic book fans. And they're stunned by this part of history. Like I said, Dr. Hayden there at the Library of Congress, she goes, you found a part of history that I'd never even heard about, and she thanked me for that. And that means a lot to me, because it means a lot to me to open people's eyes. And I don't care what it is, it's, I spend a lot of time on the internet and stuff like that. And to me, the internet is an incredible tool. Unfortunately, we use it as a weapon, and that's a tendency that human beings, have done throughout history. And, I encourage people to expose themselves to as much knowledge as they can, and that's the only thing is I just hope I helped a little bit with that.
Well, you've helped a lot, because just so much to learn here. Really appreciate it. It's been a fantastic conversation. Hopefully, once you've unsequestered yourself and you're talking comics history again, you can come back. We can maybe talk about some other things, because you were telling me about your collection. It was mind blowing. Thank you so much, Ken and Gevian and Joe. This has been great.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you, guys. I appreciate it.
Yes, thank you.